Mr. Haldon, I will not keep you waiting and we can start now. And I started to record the meeting if that's all right with you.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm very glad to be hosting today's panel and to have with us Professor John Haldon. It's a real pleasure to have us today. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Haldon. And I'll turn it over to you to introduce yourself.
So my name, as you heard, is John Haldon. I retired from Princeton University recently. I was professor of Byzantine Studies and Hellenic Studies, and also professor of European History. And I also directed the Climate Change in History Research Initiative. Um, Originally, I'm really a scholar of the Byzantine or medieval East Roman world, but I was also trained partly as an archaeologist when I was an undergraduate and graduate student. And so I've combined history with latterly archaeology, but also for the last 15 years or so with paleo-environmental and paleoclimatic studies. And I've written quite a lot on various things connected with that. I've also done some eccentrically strange things, such as studied the origins of Greek fire and various other uh, little questions of that sort. But that my main sort of interest now and for the last 10 or 12 years has been the intersection of human societies with environment and climate.
Thank you. And to begin with my questions, I like to start with your own intellectual journey because it just sits at the heart of so much of your work. You began as a historian of Byzantine institutions and administration, yet your work later expanded into archaeology, environmental history, and climate research. What intellectual risk did you take by crossing disciplines, and how did those choices shape your work rather than dilute it?
So that's a good question because, as you said, I started out as a straight historian, really, social, economic, and institutional historian of the medieval world, and particularly the Byzantine world. But bearing in mind that part of my training as an undergraduate was as an archaeologist, both in Greece and in the British Isles, I've always had an interest in archaeology, and it's, of course, really important that historians make good use of archaeology when they're studying purely historical questions, assuming it's relevant, of course. In terms of risks, um, I suppose the biggest risk really is that you start something new and don't do it well. In other words, when you begin a new trajectory or a set of new interests, you need to make sure that you understand the methodological foundations of the scholarship that you're exploiting, and that if you're going to do it yourself, that you have the appropriate methodological and theoretical framework within which to operate and through which to be educated. So part of the risk management strategy for an individual is to actually make sure that you reach out to people who are specialists in the fields with which you may be less familiar and learn from them as much as you can. And don't be afraid to say, I don't understand something. Can you please explain it to me? Which is the same lesson we teach our children and our students anyway. So it's a lesson that we should never forget. However established or experienced you are, you still, you're always learning. If I can just add one other thing, as I say to my students, the unfortunate thing about getting old is that the older you get, the more you know you don't know, which is sad.
Thank you. And the idea of crossing disciplines brings us nicely to your work on the ground. And one of the places that really comes together with those interdisciplinary choices is the Avkat Archaeological Project. And I believe that it combines archaeological fieldwork, environmental data, historical sources, and how did working in the Anatolian landscape change your understanding of ordinary Byzantine communities, especially people who left no written records? And challenge assumptions you held earlier in your career as an historian.
So the really important thing about that is that when you're living in a landscape, even for a short time, you begin to appreciate the challenges that the people who live there all the time have to deal with, both in terms of seasonal changes, but also in terms of general climatic conditions on the one hand, and just as importantly, the topography and the geography of the area. In other words, do people move around the landscape? How long does it take to get from A to B, whether on foot or on a four-legged animal or by car? The sorts of practical things that looking at a map can't tell you. And I think one of the problems that many historians and archaeologists face if they don't go to visit the landscape in which their work is rooted, they miss the lived environment, as it were. They miss the very simple things about how you perceive the landscape when you're in it and looking around at it and watching people working in it and living in it. So it makes a huge difference then as to how you write about it, because you have a better sense, a better feel, if you like, for that landscape. And that's very important. One of the things that I find always irritating is how many historians write articles about a particular part of the world. Let's take the Byzantine world, for example, Anatolia or the Balkans, and there are no maps. Now, the map by itself doesn't really help unless you can make the map a reality by visiting the landscape. But a map is the first step. But then going to visit the landscape and seeing what it's like and how it works makes a big difference. And I've encouraged all my own graduate students over the years to visit the Balkans or Anatolia or Syria when it was possible, places that they're studying, to see what that landscape's like. And they've all said it makes a huge difference to how they then think about the history of the region.
Actually, that's really interesting and it has opened a new perspective for us. And continuing on with people who left little to no written records, and archaeology often reveals the lives of these kinds of people, the community, the ordinary. How did material evidence from Anatolia change what we know about ordinary Byzantine communities and their relationships to the state?
It refers back really to the response I gave to the question just now. When you realize what the landscape looks like and how people work and live in it, that makes a difference to how you understand the sources and texts, as well as the archaeological material evidence that you're using when you're interpreting the past. And so it's particularly important, I think, to think about that in terms, for example, of, as I said, how people move around the landscape, how important are different sorts of animals in that landscape, horses, donkeys, mules, domestic animals, sheep, cattle, and so forth, pigs, on the one hand. And then secondly, thinking about how the state penetrated that landscape in terms of managing the population and the resources that that population represents in terms of people, manpower, labor power, perhaps, as well as livestock and crops that are cultivated. And so it gives you a different perspective from the bottom up, if you like, from the ground up, about the challenges faced by any political system, any system through which political power and authority is organized hierarchically, and how that power is transmitted from the top to the bottom and then through resources and through the exploitation of resources from the bottom back up to the top. So I think it's particularly important when one is thinking about states, and later on we'll talk about state collapse and so forth. But when you're talking about a state of any sort, even a small territorial or tribal state, such as the early Seljuk emirates and so forth, to think about how they move around the land and how the land can determine what they can do with it and in it. And these are very important in terms of politics as well as in terms of social life and economics.
And that's actually really fascinating for us. And my other question to you is that working so closely with lived landscapes also raises an important questions about responsibility. And working in regions rich in cultural heritage also raises ethical questions. What responsibilities do historians and archaeologists have toward local communities, especially when research and site inspections intersect with modern political and or environmental challenges?
So things have changed a lot really in the last 50 or so years. It's now assumed when you take an archaeological or survey team into an area, that you will talk to not just the local authorities, who may be able to grant you permission to access certain resources or areas, but you should also talk to the inhabitants of the communities that you're working with. And we found, and colleagues have found in many other field projects I've been involved with, that it's really essential to talk to people who live on the land and in the communities with whom you're interacting. Firstly, because they have information that may never be written down anywhere about the use of the land and recent and less recent exploitation of the landscape, population movements, and things like that, which may not be recorded. Secondly, they have an enormous amount of, if you like, inherited cultural knowledge and know-how about the landscape. Um, and then thirdly, you need their support and help if you're to work profitably in a particular area. And it's important, therefore, to think about collaborating with local stakeholders. We found, particularly in Betuzu, formerly Avkat, talking, getting the support of the village headman and the village elders was really important, as well as people who would not live there necessarily, but would commute in for various reasons, like school teachers. And so getting to talk to school teachers on the one hand, to the local farmers on the other, and their representatives, as well as the local emniet and the gendarme and so forth. If we're sticking with Anatolia, then, the representatives of the state in different forms. I have to say, as you'd expect, our experience with the police on the one hand, the gendarme on the other, is varied. Sometimes it's very positive, sometimes it's less positive, but you have to learn to work around that. And the same would apply if you're working in Britain or France or the United States. I mean, working with local people and local stakeholders is crucial. And it wasn't like that before, the 1980s, 1990s. Archaeologists, even indigenous archaeologists from the areas in question, would often treat the local people very sort of, what's the right term? Unfeelingly. They'd assume that the locals had no interest or knowledge and were uneducated, and that they should just do what they were told. And that never works.
Okay, and that actually, that explanation raises a question in me. Have you ever made discoveries and new informations within the local communities at the Avkat Archaeological Project?
So, can you repeat the question? I didn't understand the last bit.
Did you find new information or made new discoveries within the local communities at Avkat?
Do you mean about the local community or about the
Yeah,
archaeology?
about the local community or the archaeology.
Well, both, I suppose. First of all, we learned from some of the very elderly people in our village about the history of the population during and before the Second World War, for example, which we didn't know about before. We could then follow that up by looking in archives for regional and local Turkish newspapers published in the 1930s, for example. And so some of the work that we did had a sort of social anthropological element to it, looking at local ways of living, local traditions, as well as looking at local dialect and language, for example. In terms of things on the ground, scientific information, we also learned about things that had been robbed or disappeared. So, for example, as you know, a big problem in Turkey is antiquities theft, and we learned that where we thought there had been a church, based on our survey work and surface ceramic analysis and so forth, there had been found about 20 years before we were there a mosaic, but the mosaic had been lifted and stolen. And so it didn't survive and it disappeared completely, of course. But the one of the elderly men that we spoke to remembered what the imagery of the mosaic was. And it was clearly an image of a saint killing a dragon. and that was from the church floor of the church that would have been for Saint Theodore, who was the cult saint of that region. So we didn't have any scientific evidence for this, but there was no reason to disbelieve him because he wouldn't have known about Saint Theodore and that cult in any case. So, you can use local evidence and information to supplement and add to your scientific data. But you only get that if you talk to people and respect them and chat with them and get on with them in a sort of collaborative way, rather than treat them as objects to be dealt with as part of the landscape, in a sense.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that's really nice to treat them nicely, and I really like that it has evolved over time. And following up with my new question, at the same time, your work makes extensive use of new technologies and tools and data sets. And I want to ask you, as historians increasingly use digital mapping, environmental data, and modeling, how do you balance the power of these tools with human clarity interpretation? And what can go wrong if the data is treated as self-explanatory?
Well, the first thing to say is that data should never be treated as self-explanatory because, of course, you don't know unless you control the data, both in the inputting process as well as in the product, as to whether that data is going to be either complete and reliable or not. And so, unfortunately, you can't rely simply on an artificial intelligence model for assessing the material. Once you've got to the stage of collecting all your data and rationally organizing it, then you can apply digital technologies to organize and make it accessible in multiple formats so that you can ask questions of the data. But the important thing to bear in mind with any system is that if it's created by human beings, it'll have some of the flaws of human beings. And if you set up a program based on your questions, a different scholar might come along and ask different questions and produce a different sort of program, even though the evidence might remain the same. So you need to be aware of that at all times. In other words, you have to be constantly on your guard against making methodological assumptions which might be problematic in terms of how your results then appear.
And actually, I have another question regarding technology and how has technology fundamentally changed the kinds of historical questions we can now ask, or has it produced new or introduced new limitations to our historical questions?
Well, the first thing again would be that it's enormously expanded the sorts of questions we can ask, because we can now ask a question, for example, what sorts of crops were grown in a particular area over 2 or 3 centuries. And if we have appropriate data, for example, fossilized pollen data from a lake bed, we can answer that question and actually say, as we can now in many areas of Turkey, what was being grown in the fields near to where the site of the fossilized pollen is located over a long period. And that tells us about demographics, it tells us about local economics, and so forth. What can it tell us about questions that we already could ask? Um, uh, Firstly, it can help us refine the answers. More importantly, it can corroborate or challenge assumptions we've made before we had the new data, before we had access to the new technology, as it were. So you may have a question, for example, actually the landscape use issue is a good example. We know quite a lot about what might be grown in some areas of Anatolia based on written texts or based on epigraphic data, both from classical times and beyond into the medieval period. Um, but we had, until we started using paleoecological evidence, fossilized pollen, for example, we had no way of corroborating that or providing a timescape, if you like, a chronology for it. So, and often our answers were not incorrect, but now we can make them far more precise and much more refined. But occasionally we can show that actually our assumptions based on the textual evidence were wrong. And that's obviously a huge step forward.
Thank you. That has underlined and highlighted many of our misunderstandings of new technologies and the new limitations. And I have another question regarding climate history. And as you mentioned, you were the director of Climate Change and History Research Initiative. And to this day, how do you help students understand the role of climate in history without treating it as one answer to every historical problem?
The short answer to that, which is a good question, because determinism and reductionism, as you imply, are pretty common and they're easy to fall into. The first response to that would be by beginning from the point that social systems are complex, and therefore it's never likely that one single causal factor will bring about significant change. It can happen. For example, if you have a huge volcanic eruption that simply buries a town, as with Pompeii, clearly then you have one catastrophic environmental impact. But generally, it's more complex than that. And more often than not, those sorts of single event catastrophes are fairly obvious. Um, and a single event catastrophe generally wouldn't affect a whole cultural system. It would affect one element in that cultural system. So if you see societies as complex dynamic systems. And I think a complexity approach to social systems is really the best way forward. You then inevitably have to think about all the other possible causal relationships that come into play. Um, and the difficulty is locating the mechanisms for any particular sets of changes and then allocating causal priority, if you like, to all the different factors. So, um, uh, let's say at one point in time in a particular society, climate will play a slightly more significant role combined with many other things than at a later point or an earlier point. Climate still plays a role, but it may the position of that role in the complex system will be slightly different on each occasion. So the historian's job is to take that apart and, as it were, clarify the relationships that exist between the different elements.
Thank you. And moving on, you mentioned Pompeii, and I want to ask about one of your books. In The Empire That Would Not Die, you describe Byzantine survival as paradoxical. Based on administrative structures and Anatolian evidence, what does resilience actually look like in pre-modern societies, and why is this often misunderstood in popular history?
Okay, so the reason I referred to it as paradoxical is simply because if you look at it on the face of things, the empire is small and poor, and it's facing a huge, colossal, very wealthy Islamic empire. And so the challenge for me was why did it survive at all? It should have actually been overwhelmed, and it wasn't. So then we have some questions because as soon as you put it that way, you have to say, well, what are the elements of survival or resilience? And so coming back to your question of resilience, resilience has to include what I would call, and systems theorists would call redundancy. In other words, a system that's resilient will have some flexibility built into its structures so that if part of the system fails, other bits of the system will, as it were, step in and keep the whole operation functioning. And a system that is less resilient won't have that capacity. And so when part of the system fails, it'll create a sort of domino effect, and the whole system will fail as a result. And if you want a parallel for today, the way in which the global commercial markets work today is to have deliveries timed to be right just as they're needed. In other words, goods arrive in the shops just when they're needed, not before and not late. But if that system is interrupted by the delay caused by internet collapse, for example, or ships being late, then the whole system begins to suffer. And so that system of super efficiency, which looks good in terms of profits, is actually very unresilient when it comes to dealing with stresses. So if that system is stressed, it will break down quite quickly. It might recover quite quickly as well, depending on other elements. But that's a useful parallel if you want to think about it in those terms. In other words, is there any flexibility or elasticity in a system? Does it have capacity or spare capacity to take up the slack when something goes wrong? And in the Byzantine case, or in the case of other states one can talk about, you can talk about this, for example, in the Ottoman state in the 16th century, which coped with a series of very dramatic crises until in the sort of 1590s and the long war with the Habsburgs and then the Jalal rebellions. That redundancy was all used up, and the system began to crack. Of course, the Ottoman state didn't collapse, but it had to transform in ways which it didn't have to do at an earlier period. So redundancy and resilience, I think, are crucial.
Okay, that's really enlightening. Thank you. And moving on with a question that is regarding to our audience. Many young people today feel pressure to pursue useful or technical careers. What convinced you that studying history, especially pre-modern world, could be intellectually rigorous and socially meaningful?
Well, I have to say your question presumes that I actually gave it any thought when I was a graduate student. I was just completely fascinated by history, and that's all I wanted to do. I didn't really think about whether it would be a good career or not. Um, Having said that, once you're in a career, then you can consider what the options are for, if necessary, stepping outside that career and doing something else if you can't get a position, for example. And the one thing I would say, which also bears on what you're thinking about advice to the next generation, is that studying history provides you with a lot of transferable skills. Firstly, in analytical capacity, because you have to learn how to analyze complex data sets, not mathematically, of course, but in terms of your sources and the secondary literature that you have to read and assess and evaluate. It also provides you with a sophisticated literary vocabulary through which you can express yourself. And it also provides you with a fairly wide background of cultural knowledge, not just for your own culture, probably, but for many other cultures as well. And these are really important. It means that you can do a degree in history and then you can actually retrain to become a whole range of other things very successfully thereafter. And so I think history, just like the study of literature, um, uh, but from a different perspective, is actually a really good grounding for a fulfilling career, even if you don't become a historian. So I think that's the way I would look at it. There is connected with that, there is a question about whether, given the problem with academic jobs in all the countries that we know, whether we should, is it morally correct to be continuing to train historians when there are so few jobs for historians? And one answer would be, well, no, we should not train so many historians because they're not all going to get jobs as historians. My answer would be, firstly, to go back to the point I just made, that if people really are trained as historians, they have a range of other transferable skills that they can then use to retrain for other careers. But secondly, I've always found it very difficult when students, graduate students in particular, applied to me to study history, say at Princeton. The people who apply are obviously obsessed with history. They're fanatically interested in history. They don't want to do anything else. So it's not really my moral responsibility to tell them that they can't do what they really want to do. If they're good enough and they really want to do it, that's fine. I'll train them how to do it. And they can then make life decisions for themselves.
Yeah, thank you for your perspective. It's really valuable. And moving on, for students who are interested in history or archaeology but unsure about the future, what skills or ways of thinking they should start developing now, and what risks are worth taking along the way?
I think the best answer to that is a combination of what I was just saying, plus read a lot, learn about other cultures. History is a very good way to get into the way in which other cultures and cultural systems have worked in the past as well as in the present, uh, and that will always stand you in good stead.
Thank you so much. Does our audience have any questions for Mr. Haldon?
Actually, I have one.
Yes,
Yes.
Melis.
I would like to ask a slightly more fun question, actually.
Hmm.
As a historian, when you look back to our present day from many years from later on, which events do you think will be remembered as the most significant in our history?
That requires me to look into the future. Um, who can tell? I mean, the current situation internationally is it seems to me very dangerous. Um, uh, you know, uh, what will the Europeans do if Mr. Trump decides to take over Greenland? You've all been reading about it in the news. This will cause a major crisis in European and North American politics. It might encourage the People's Republic of China to simply invade Taiwan. It might encourage Mr. Putin to carry on fighting in Ukraine or invade somebody else as well. I mean, that could be one of the most important things that we'd look back on. It certainly, I think what's happening now, we could certainly look back in a few months' time and say these were mistakes that people should not have been doing these things. So who can tell? I don't know. I don't know. On the other hand, at a purely personal level, I don't know what's going to happen to me next week. I may fall over and break my leg, and then I might think, well, if only I'd never walked into the street on that day. So you can go from the trivial to the very sort of sublime and important. So I'm sorry I
Thank
can't
you.
really give you a question without having a sort of future to predict.
Thank you very much. And also, I have another question too,
Hmm.
but it's a more fun question, actually. You mentioned the mosaic which requires a dragon in it.
Yeah.
So, do you think it is possible that such extraordinary creatures actually existed in the past?
Okay, it's a fun question, but no. I mean, we have enough paleontological evidence to tell us what did exist and what didn't, and there weren't dragons. Of course, people can see in things that really are there all sorts of things that really are not there, because people are very good at inventing ideas and creating myths about things. Um, and in the parts of the world where there are dragons, like the Komodo dragon in the Far East, for example, which is a long dragon-like creature, who knows that the concept of a dragon wasn't transmitted somehow in the deep past from that part of the world to other parts of the world. But more likely is that the concept of a dragon is completely sort of mythical and invention, and then we apply the word dragon to anything that we actually find that could look like it. In other words, human beings go around naming things in the world, and when we name things, we then apply those names to other things that we find.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Something before Mr. Helling goes. I had a question. So
Sure.
I'd like to ask to like furthermore explain the dragon situation. I just like looked up a image of a mosaic of a dragon found in a church with Saint George on it. The
Hmm.
dragon looks like one of those. What do you just said it yourself, Mr. Haldon.
Oh, the Komodo dragon.
The Komodo dragons, yeah, it
Yeah,
looks more like
yeah,
a Komodo dragon,
yeah.
but why is it like that? And like, why does this different representation of dragons occur in different cultures?
That's a question you'd have to ask a dragon expert. I've never really given it any thought. Like I said, I think human beings are very good at inventing scary creatures and scary animals as part of their legendary panoply, if you like. And the idea of a dragon presumably comes from the ways in which people in the past, long before writing, perceived the world around them and some of the creatures that they saw. So if you look at, quite small reptiles, for example, that you might see in any country in the world, and then imagine a big version of one of those, then you can have a dragon that way. Dragons with wings, that's obviously an elaboration that people have added because they need to explain how dragons fly around and do stuff. But really, I have absolutely zero idea as to the actual origins of dragon stories. I suspect some anthropologist somewhere has probably written on them. And I dare say if you do a search, an online search for origins of dragons, you might find some interesting sort of social anthropological literature on the topic. But I don't think dragons actually ever existed as such, except in our minds and then in our art and in our stories.
I thank you for your answer. I'm glad to hear it.
Okay, thanks.
May
I
I
think
also ask
Atesh
you a
had a
question, Mr.
question.
Haldon?
Yeah, go ahead.
So, it's about your personal opinion. So it's when we think about the past and the people that lived in the past, like 500, 600, or like more ago, it's
Hmm.
really hard to think as them as like human beings, as like to emphasize with them because like their lives are so much different than us,
Yeah.
and like there's a lot in between. So, do you think that it's that different actually, or is it just an illusion?
Well, of course, it was different in terms of the surroundings of your life, your health chances, how long you lived, to some extent, your physical shape. If you're working in a field all day, then you're going to have more musculature and probably live less long than if you're sitting at a desk, and so forth. So lifestyle and your position in society make a big difference. And then, of course, technologically, we've seen huge changes in the last century, but particularly in the last really 25 years. Things have speeded up enormously. When I was a little boy, there were hardly any cars on the streets, even in big cities. And there were still people going around working with horses and carts and horses. I mean, that's in the 1950s and late 1940s. So things have changed completely. Um, and yet the human being is still there, as you say. So people are the same. And of course, in terms of our physiology and our biology, we've been the same for the last 150,000 years. And it's a mistake to think that people in the past were less intelligent or less able than us. They had fewer tools with which to work of the sort that we're used to, but they had advantages over us in other respects. For example, we find it increasingly hard, and I think your generation probably even harder than mine, to memorize a large amount of material because everything's available online. When I was a little boy, you had to memorize a lot of stuff, poetry, literature, and so forth, because that's how you learned it. When my father was little, he had to memorize huge amounts of text, and he could do it. He's fine. He was only a carpenter, but he just knew how to remember things. So, you can lose, as it were, competence in your human toolkit, if you like, if you don't make use of it. Use it or lose it, they say, right? So, but the heart of your question is whether people have remained the same, and people basically subject to their situation in life, their diet, their environment, and so forth. People are the same, and they have the same potential for understanding the world, depending on what sort of cultural context they're born into.
Mhm.
I will add one other thing, and that is that your question's a good one from the point of view of thinking in terms of time. Most people who aren't trained to be historians find it very difficult to conceptualize time as being real for anyone in the past. And your question really relates to one of the points I've made in some of my writing recently. We have to remember that when we're talking, let's go back to a period which you've all studied at school, probably the Ottoman Empire. If we imagine 16th century Ottoman Turkey, Anatolia, we talk about historical events and we compress whole lifetimes into a couple of sentences. And one of the things it's worth trying to do is to think yourself out of that compressing process. So remember that the people you're dealing with, when you say that, Suleiman ordered his armies to invade wherever, Hungary, for example, um, remember that those armies are made up of tens of thousands of people who lived for 30 to 40 to 50 or even 60 years and possibly longer, and had their own lives to live through and didn't see the world in the way that we see it as having already been finished. We look back on everything as a completed experiment in a sense, but they are in the experiment. They're being experimented on. If you imagine it like that, it makes it's a good way to remind yourselves that we're dealing with whole lifetimes of people just like ourselves. So I think your question is a really nice one because it opens up several other interesting challenges for people who want to think about history. So thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haldon. Also, I find it very scary because like it also means that in the future, our whole lives will be compressed into few sentences too,
Yeah,
and like we are mortal.
we are. Yes, it's annoying to think about it, but I'm afraid we are. Good.
Thank you.
I believe Ganesh also has a question.
Yes, I also have a question.
Hmm.
Sometimes we hear things like if something was invented just a little bit before, like a steam engine or some other scientific discovery, it would affect our present time drastically. Do you think it's like that, or they would all balance it out and we'll be about the same point we are right now?
Mostly, I think the latter. I think it wouldn't make a big difference. So, for example, the steam engine, in principle, was invented in Alexandria in the second century BCE. It was two hemispheres with a vent on each side in a frame filled with hot water and then heated. And of course, as the water inside boiled, the steam shot out of the vents and made the hemispheres go round and round and round. So a simple steam engine. But all the other parts of the steam engine weren't yet available to use. There was no application for it other than as a scientific experiment. And there are lots of things like that in the past we can find where somebody's come across a particular thing, but there's been no application for it. That begins to change really only during the Industrial Revolution when you get the beginnings of scientific empirical experiments, and the discovery of things like electricity and so forth. But even so, I think the general picture, a human society is made up of innumerable composite elements. And just because one element changes doesn't mean that it's going to have a very big effect on anything else. If you want to look at this, I don't know how good your mathematics are, mine aren't very good, but you can look at this through chaos theory. And chaos theory gives you a very nice way of thinking about um, uh, causes which are so numerous we can't possibly locate them all, but which in the end produce a sort of coherent totality. And you have to think of societies like that, which is also a bit frightening, but there we go.
Yes, I agree. It's a bit frightening. Thank you so much.
If anyone doesn't have any questions, if it's all right with everybody, can everybody open their cameras and we can take a screenshot of our really enlightening meeting, if that's all right with you, Mr. Haldon?
Sure, yeah.
Can everybody open their cameras if it's like possible? Thank you. Yeah. Melis,
Yeah,
are you
I can.
take the okay.
Some people are shy.
Yes, I took it.
Thank you again, Mr. Haldon. It's
Yes,
really
Mr. Haldon.
enlightening. Thank you
It
for your
was
time and generosity.
Yeah, it was a great pleasure for us.
Thank you so much for being with us, Professor Haldon. You have truly enlightened us, and it has been a great pleasure to hear from you and reflect on your work and your intellectual journey. Your insights into interdisciplinary research, ordinary lives, and long-term continuity have given us a richer and more thoughtful way of approaching the past. And for many of us, especially since we are students, your reflections on curiosity, intellectual risk, and responsibility have been both encouraging and inspiring. Thank you for your time, generosity, and sharing your perspective with us today.
You're very welcome. And I hope everyone understood what I was saying. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. Bye bye.
Can
Bye
I
bye.